Good afternoon and welcome to the Infrastructure and Vanpool webinar presented by Commute with Enterprise. My name is Mike Mangan. I'm the Vice President of Commute with Enterprise, and with me today is Cheryl O'Connor, Corporate Commute Manager working with the public sector. Live from DC, we have Jason Pavlicek with Pavlicek and Associates, two tremendous industry experts. I'm excited to say we have over 300 registered for our webinar today and look forward to a productive hour. So let's get started by looking at the agenda. I've introduced our speakers for today. Jason will provide a summary of the bill before transitioning to Cheryl, who will discuss the bill's impact on Vanpool specifically. We'll close things out by giving you a sneak peek at some of the great things we're working on with our product and services. The chat is live, and we'll have folks monitoring that as well as answering your questions. So if you have a question, click the Q&A button and submit. Those we don't get to today in our time together, we'll answer those and send in a follow-up email later this week. We also have a couple poll questions coming throughout the presentation. Two of them will be poll style, and one will ask you to submit the answers in the chat. So on that note, let's get rolling with our first poll question. Who do we have on the call today? Are you with a private company, public federal agency, public state agency, or public local agency?
Wow,
a couple
bunch
minutes.
of public local. Thanks for joining us, guys.
All right. Well, thank you for your responses. It's great to know a little bit about our audience before we dive in. Now for a little bit about Enterprise and our Commute division. Our company, Enterprise Holdings, owns National Car Rental, Alamo Rent-A-Car, as well as our flagship Enterprise Rent-A-Car brand. But our portfolio is more than it might seem on the surface. The Enterprise brand, for example, includes a wide variety of mobility options to meet the driving public's local transportation needs. These include truck rental, exotic car rental, automated car sharing, and vanpooling through Commute with Enterprise, as well as car sales. For businesses, government agencies, and other organizations, our affiliate, Enterprise Fleet Management, operates a full-service fleet management offering. So as you can see, we're much more than car rental. We provide transportation solutions wherever and however customers need them. This is the mission of Enterprise Holdings. We're committed to being the best mobility provider in the world, and we do that by listening to our customers and exceeding their expectations. We see ourselves as a company that gets people where they need to go, that takes good care of our customers, that provides career development and opportunity for our employees, and that's a force for good in our communities. Providing vanpools for over 40 years, Commute with Enterprise has grown into the largest and most cost-effective vanpool operations in the U.S., operating over 7,500 vanpools in 47 states and 12,000 pre-pandemic. We partner with over 70 public transit agencies, state DOTs, municipalities, and employers across the country to provide turnkey commuter vanpool programs, thus delivering a cost-effective option for extending the reach of public transportation and expanding access to jobs while dramatically reducing congestion and emissions. Vanpool is a strategic transportation solution that offers immediate savings, safety, and sustainability. Every day, Commute with Enterprise takes 38,000 individual cars off the road. That eliminates 843 million commuter miles driven each year and eradicates the need for 38,000 parking spaces. In addition, each year, 721 million pounds of carbon emissions are reduced by Commute with Enterprise customers. And it's supported by the extensive Enterprise Rent-A-Car neighborhood network, which delivers a level of fleet flexibility and local service unmatched in the vanpool industry. All right, I will now turn this over to Jason Pavlicek to dig in a little deeper on the infrastructure bill.
Thank you, Mike, and I appreciate being here and look forward to spending some time with all of you, albeit virtually. I want to dive right into IIJA, also known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill, Build Back Better, numerous titles that the press and media have given it to it, but IIJA is actually the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. It is a generational, and I do mean generational, piece of legislation. I personally have been working on transportation policy for 25 years, and I feel like in many ways it's built up to this piece of legislation. So with that, there's a lot to celebrate. but there's also a lot of work to do, as this type of investment will require all of you and all of us to really meet the demands that come from this legislation. The IIJA infrastructure package was bipartisan. It passed the Senate with nearly 70 votes and passed the House with numerous Democrats and Republicans involved in the process. As I mentioned, in terms of generational investment, it really dramatically increases the amount of funding that come to surface transportation. One thing I'll note about this piece of legislation is that it is not just surface transportation. It also includes other forms of infrastructure, including broadband, water, airports, and other hard infrastructure. But what we're going to focus today on is really the surface transportation bill. Ordinarily, we'd be covering these policies as a part of reauthorization. But because of the process and because of how all this came together, the overarching piece of legislation combines both the reauthorization and a spending package that provides funding for the next 5 years. What we're going to focus on again is some of that spending that is dedicated to surface transportation. Keep in mind that this was a 2,700-page document. And while I'd certainly be more than happy to go over all 2,007 pages with all of you, I think you'll all be asleep by 5 o'clock. So instead, what I've decided we'll do is highlight some of the new policies and some of the more exciting elements of this legislation, especially as it comes to state and local governments and regional governments. So looking at the legislation from a big picture, as I mentioned, the legislation includes $567 billion for surface transportation, dramatic increases for both transit, highway, and rail spending for the next 5 years. What is very, very interesting in terms of this piece of legislation is that for many years, our federal transportation policy has been based upon an infrastructure policy. We build roads, we buy rail, we buy buses. We're beginning to see new themes being incorporated into our transportation bill: multimodalism, resiliency, innovation. One of the landmark pieces of this legislation, and we'll go through a lot of the elements of this, is how there's more direct access to fund transportation and infrastructure projects for local and regional governments. There's also an increased investment in both carbon reduction and electrification. One of the other key elements of this legislation is how much money will be controlled by US DOT. Generally speaking, US DOT only controls, in form of competitive grants, about a couple $1 billion a year. However, with this piece of legislation, $100 billion over the course of it will be controlled by US DOT, a significant amount greater than in the past. So the Biden administration in particular will put its input on how a lot of this money is spent. What you have here in this next page is effectively the legislation. I will not go through this line by line. I will not try to explain all of these lines. I simply want to put this up here because it's a visualization of how grand this legislation is. But over the course of the next 20 minutes, I will go through a number of these programs, both new and old. But before we get to that, before we get started, what I wanted to do is see who here, what excites you? What is concerns you about this legislation? What are things that you are thinking about? So in the chat, feel free to put in, chat in what concerns you, what excites you, things you want to know about. And over the course of the next 20 minutes, hopefully we'll be able to get to some of these pieces. And if not, we will certainly follow up with any questions you have. But for right now, if there's things you're thinking about, put it in there and we'll do our best to respond to it in some way, shape, or form. Let's get started by going through some of the formula programs that were reauthorized as a part of the federal highway program. I want to cover two in particular. The first one is the Congestion Mitigation Air Quality Program, more commonly known as CMAQ. This is a program that is provided to state DOTs and regional governments to clean their air, effectively addressing both ozone and particulate matter. CMAQ is a well-known program to many of you, especially in the regional and municipal government world. CMAQ in this legislation grew by 10%. Now, many of you are probably listening to me right now and saying, wait a minute, you said generational. 10% is a significant increase, but it's not generational. You're not wrong. But what I will mention later is that there are other programs related to carbon reduction that have been created that will sort of answer why CMAQ only grew by 10%. That being said, CMAQ did grow in a decent amount. When I first started in the transportation policy world, the CMAQ program was a $700 million program overall. It was very, very small, and regional local governments were happy to get a couple $100,000. It's great to see that the program itself over the next 5 years will be $13.5 billion. A couple of pieces of policy as a part of the CMAQ program that I want to point out. One in particular is that in the past, agencies could not use CMAQ funding to fund operations. It was something that was a part of regulations, that there was a known as a 3-year limit on operating expenses. Over time, that 3-year limit became a 5-year limit, with the last 3 years being required to be sort of cascading down to reduce the amount of investment made in operating expenses. However, that legislation, that piece or that regulation has been taken out, and now you can use CMAQ funding to fund operating costs, so long as that funding and the allocation of funds for that operating cost continue to show carbon reduction and air quality improvement. So as long as the project is working, you can use the funds for capital or operating costs. A really, really, really foundational change for many of you that have used CMAQ. You understand what I'm talking about. There's also some additions to the CMAQ program. I think my favorite part of the last 20 years has been how the CMAQ program started with 7 or 8 eligibilities. It's now up to 25, and for good reason. Included in the eligibilities for the CMAQ program are now micromobility, including bike shared and shared scooter systems, as well as the purchase of heavy-duty zero-emission vehicles and related charging infrastructure. That in particular is related to port infrastructure and some of the needs of some of our ports to reduce freight movement, carbon emission reduction, et cetera. So it's certainly some changes to CMAQ that I think it certainly will make it improve it. But I think the most foundational thing is there is an increase. The next federal highway program I want to talk about is the Surface Transportation Block Grant Program, or STP. As you see here, there's more dramatic increase, 23.5% increase over the FAST Act. The program itself is authorized at $72 billion over 5 years. One of the things that many of us were working on, unfortunately, that did not come to fruition was to see more funding sub-allocated or set aside for regional governments. That number remains at 55%. There was some hope that would increase to 60%. Unfortunately, the legislation, it remains at 55%. But with an overall increase in the amount of money going to STP, regional governments will now have more money to play with and more money to address the needs of other communities. One element that I want to add that was included in the legislation is that a 4th population band for small cities was added. In the past, cities and regional areas under 200,000, the Surface Transportation Block Grant money was really in many ways controlled by state DOTs. They managed the program. With this 4th population band, small urban areas between 50,000 and 200,000 will have more of a say in how their regions and how their dollars attributed to their area are spent. The state must now consult and work with those MPOs to develop plans and project selection. In addition, there's a continued expansion of eligibilities, including wildlife crossing, electric vehicle charging, continued expansion of ITS technologies, resilience, et cetera. 2 other points that I want to mention as the program, for many of you that in the regional government world, the off-system bridge set aside increased from 15 to 20%, giving local governments more funding to deal with bridges that have structural integrity problems that may not be on the national highway system. In addition, the Transportation Alternatives Program set aside increased, and the amount provided within that sub-program to regional governments also increased. For those of you who are unfamiliar, the Transportation Alternatives Program is a program for active transportation, bicycle, pedestrian projects, et cetera. And that is a set aside within the STP program. So the set aside itself grew, something that many in the community, transportation community, were fighting for. Before we move into some of the new programs created by the legislation, one of the things I want to note is that it continues to, the federal match for transportation project remains at generally an 80-20 split, meaning that if the total project cost was $1, 80 cents could be federal dollars, and then 20 cents had to be some type of local dollars. But it's important to remind folks that there's a number of safety and congestion relief programs that are 100% federal. So whether you're using STP dollars, CMAQ, what have you, a number of projects can be funded entirely with federal dollars. That does include commuter carpooling and commuter van pooling program. Now that is specifically for federal highway dollars. Later on in our presentation, Cheryl will talk to you guys a little bit about how you can use federal transit dollars for 100%. But let's get into some of the new programs created by the Federal Highway Administration. And it starts out with the carbon reduction program. As I mentioned at the onset, CMAQ only grew by 10%, but part of the reason why it didn't grow as fast or as much as some of the other core formula programs is that there's a creation of a new carbon reduction program. This legislation creates a $6.4 billion carbon reduction program. There's a very, very narrow set of eligible projects. Within this program, 65% of the funding must be sub-allocated to metropolitan areas. So again, a focus on giving more money to municipal and local governments to address transportation problems, not just infrastructure problems. As you see here with the eligible projects, what you see is a real focus on operational management, ITS, TDM, mode shift, things of that nature. How do we get more people through the same space faster? How do we get people from having to take trips? Those are the types of programs and projects that are eligible through the carbon reduction program. The legislation also requires state DOTs to make a plan. Those plans are effectively a statewide plan on how to reduce carbon, setting goals on carbon reduction, setting goals on VMT reduction. As a part of that plan development, states must coordinate with regional metropolitan planning organizations. So the MPOs themselves are not required to develop any new plans. However, they have to work with the state DOT to develop metro plans and metro carbon reduction plans. Many of you already have those plans either because of your status as a TMA or because of being in a non-attainment area. Nonetheless, the ability and the opportunity to dramatically expand some of the program offerings at a regional level exist through the carbon reduction program. Another new program, and real quickly, I just want to go through some of the timings. I know one of the questions that comes up quite often is when all of this, these programs will be implemented and offered and what have you. The carbon reduction program, because it's a formula program, technically the funding is available once this year's full appropriations are available. Federal Highways has already made a partial, what is known as allocation, letting state and local governments know how much money they have to spend for this calendar year. We expect that Congress will complete the FY22 budget sometime in February, just 5 years into the budget year. No big deal, early for them. Hopefully some of you can sense my sarcasm there. This spring, we expect Congress or at Federal Highways to begin to work with state DOTs and MPOs to begin to develop the planning process. Guidance and regulations to state DOTs as well as MPOs will come out on this program this summer. What is interesting, though, is that it's our guess that within the first 2 years of the program, there will not be a plan in place. So if you are thinking about projects and programs and ways to use this money, the first 2 years in some ways will be like the wild, wild west, where you don't have a regional plan necessarily in place or a state plan in place. But we do imagine that most MPOs in most states will begin to solicit projects and program ideas this spring and summer. So we think it's a real opportunity for many of you on the phone here, or on the webinar here, as well as a way to really impact people's lives. States and MPOs will have 2 years, by the way, to complete those programs. Again, as I mentioned at the onset, one of the foundations of this legislation are the new competitive grant programs. In the past, there was a small amount of money that a lot of people try to go after, and it made many of these programs overly competitive, too competitive in some ways. Not to say that the programs will not be competitive going forward. I think there will be competitive. The good news, though, is that there's lots of different opportunities for local governments, regional governments, transit agencies, and state governments to apply for funding for a variety of different projects. What I want to start with is the congestion relief program. This was authorized as a part of the legislation. It will be a $50 million a year program, $250 million over 5 years. The focus here, again, very much like the carbon reduction program, is to get more people through less area as fast as possible. So a heavy focus on TDM, ITS, operational type projects and programs, pricing as well. The interesting element about this program is that the congestion relief program will only be open to regional areas, metropolitan statistical areas of 1 million or greater. Now, the interesting thing here is that let's take the Dallas, Texas region, for example. The region there is certainly over 1 million, but the city of Arlington within that region is not over 1 million. But the city, because the city is within the larger region, the city itself could apply. So any municipal entity within a large urban area of 1 million or more can apply. Now, that said, I am certain that federal highways and certainly the intent of Congress is looking for regions to create region-wide solutions. They're not interested in one city block in one small city of a large urban area. What they're looking for is how can we create a regional system of doing X, Y, Z? And as long as that X, Y, and Z equals congestion reduction. Again, one other element, and I'll talk about this in a moment here as well, I believe, is that one part of the congestion relief program is that going forward, all express lanes on the national highway system, any future toll road on the highway system, on the national highway system, must allow for transit and HOV3 to ride for a free or reduced price. That is a really, really historic policy when you think about how many states and how many regions are looking at expanding express lanes and using tolling as a way to create new capacity. From here on in, those lanes can be built, but they must be HOV3 or HOV free or reduced. So that's, I think, a really, really important part, something that we're excited about here. The sort of cousin program to the congestion relief program, because we don't want to forget about our friends in the rural governments, is the Rural Surface Transportation Program. This is open to any area with 200,000 people or less. A couple of things about this program is that it is authorized at $2 billion over 5 years. The eligible projects include a wide variety of both capital, operating, transit. Basically, anything that provides better transportation access is eligible under the Rural Surface Transportation Grant Program. A couple caveats, though. The project minimum for this legislation is $25 million. So if you want to build a bridge to connect two communities that are separated by a river, as long as that bridge is $25 million, you can do it. There is a set aside. There's a 10% set aside for projects and programs that create access that are below that $25 million threshold. So whether it's a van pool program in a rural area, some type of commuter bus line, whatever sort of creates better access between people and jobs and healthcare and education, there is a set aside of 10% of that $2 billion for smaller scale projects that enhance access. The next item up for bid, sometimes doing these webinars with so many new programs, I feel a little bit like a game show host. The next program is again, innovation-based. Many of you may remember back in, I believe it was 2015, the Obama administration held a Smart Cities program. And this is a program where I believe 70 plus cities competed for $40 million. The city of Columbus, Ohio eventually won that program. And over the last 5 years, working with federal highways and other partners, have created a smarter city. It was a wonderful program. And I think the most interesting part of that program is that of the 70 cities, there was 5 or 6 finalists. And of those 5 or 6 finalists, they put together really, really comprehensive plans to develop smart cities. And even though Columbus was the only one who won the funding, to my knowledge, the other finalists and many of the other cities who put together smart city proposals began to engage and find other ways to fund that smart cities plan. The hope is that that's what will happen here. The smart cities grants will create an annual smart cities program of $100 million a year. What is different from this program from the original smart cities is that there will be 3 individual sort of population pots that entities can apply for. There will be a rural program, a mid-sized program, as well as a large community. I think it's an important sort of thing to think about here is that as we begin to advance into the latter half of the 21st century, different ways that all types of governments and all types of localities can look at how innovation and technology can be used to enhance the citizens' transportation abilities. One thing I will mention, and the legislation bears this out, is that while we say the words innovation, the first thing that comes to mind is technology, but not all innovation comes in the form of a gadget or an app. Many come in the form of different business models, new way of delivering services. So something to sort of plant a seed in your mind as we move forward, that the Smart Cities Grant Program also recognizes in terms of what is and isn't eligible. So I think very exciting. Another program that I want to put on your radar screen is the Safe Streets and Roads for All grants. Many of you, again, as I mentioned, are familiar with the Transportation Alternatives Program, which was a pot of money that a lot of us fought for that would provide access to active transportation programs and projects. That pot of money gets dramatically enhanced in terms of a new competitive program that takes a look at creating and implementing Vision Zero programs. For those of you who are not familiar with Vision Zero programs, the idea of Safe Streets and Vision Zero programs is that we reduce pedestrian and bicyclist fatalities down to zero. New York City was one of the first cities to adopt a Vision Zero policy, where they begin to actually design, plan, and implement a transportation system with the hopes of getting to zero pedestrian and bicycle fatalities. Well, this program was created to not only help cities that haven't developed those plans, but also develop and implement those plans. And with $5 billion over the next 5 years, hopefully we'll feel a lot safer biking to and from work or walking to and from the movie theater down the way. There is a part of the money that is explicitly set aside for communities that have yet to deal with or have yet to develop Vision Zero plans. And then there's obviously funding and availability to implement Vision Zero plans as well. The next pot of money I want to sort of talk about, I'm going to talk about them in together. These are your three large capital programs. RAISE, which has also been called Build, and before that it was called Tiger, is a pot of money that was created actually as a part of the 2008 legislation to manage the 2008 recession. It was so popular with state and local governments that it's been funded since that time. Well, it's now finally authorized. It's a part of the actual transportation bill. So this legislation itself will provide $7.5 billion over the next 5 years to state and local governments for regional and national projects of significance. The next program is mega projects, which again is what it sounds like. It is specifically created and designed for large projects of national significance. The Gateway Tunnel in New York City, building new bridges across massive freight networks. The minimum threshold for projects in mega is 500 million. So we're talking about large generational type programs and projects. And then infra, which is more of a freight based program. Now, I'm not going to get into the details of all these, but you can see that here. But what I want to talk about is the fact that what DOT will be looking for and what Congress inferred in its legislation is that it's one thing to apply for a road. Every community in this country wants to build some type of road, wants to buy a bus to provide some type of new service. What they're going to be looking for as a part of this legislation is how comprehensive a project is. It's great that you want to build a road, but what if you synchronized lights along that road? What if you created a micro transit service connecting people to and from the bus line that runs on that service? What if you create a commuter van pool program to reduce congestion along the corridor before, during, and after the project? Those types of what I've been referring to as ornaments are going to be looked for by USDOT in project selection. So if you are a part of an agency that is looking at one of these three programs for that big project in the region, think about other small ornaments you can add on to the tree to make the project more important. Or if you're a division leader and you've got an ornament that you'd like to hang on the tree, go talk to the folks at your agency and let them know that adding $1 million fill in the blank project to a $50 million request will actually enhance the project, not take away from it. I'd like to very briefly go through the federal transit program and some of the changes made there. Now, the interesting thing about the federal transit title is that, as I mentioned before, this legislation was created in a bipartisan fashion. The one sort of holdout was the transit title. All of the different parts of the legislation on the transportation side had already sort of been pre-cooked. The Environment Public Works Committee already had a highway title written in a bipartisan fashion. The Commerce Committee already had research and safety titles written. The Banking Committee never got to that point. The chairman of the two committee, the chairman and the ranking member, really never were able to galvanize around a particular set of policies or ideas that they both agreed upon. Effectively, what happened is they agreed to disagree, and they agreed on a funding number, and then went from there. So there's very, very, very little policy change in terms of transit. The transit program you knew 3 years ago from a legal standpoint, in many ways, is the program you know now, just with a lot more money. The legislation includes $106 billion for public transit. It's an increase of $41 billion. That does not account for the additional funding that have come through other CARES Act and COVID relief packages. When you really look at the last 3 years, the amount of funding that transit has received dwarfs almost the 5 years prior to it. Now, that's a great thing, but it also presents a real, I think, danger in some ways. And I mean a danger in this way. When we look back on this legislation 5 years from now, naysayers and those supporters as well will look back and say, what did we get for our money? So as I mentioned at the onset, the challenge today is not to celebrate what we've gotten, but how do we use it? Because I truly do believe that if this money is not used to change people's lives, to move more people, to give people options they didn't have before, it will be very, very, very challenging to see this amount of money provided again. And there's some danger that all the money will go away. So I put that out there not as a Pollyannish, the sky is falling, but as a challenge to all of you here on this, is that it's time to sort of take this money and let's begin to change lives, hopefully. I'll just very quickly go into some of the dollar amounts and just a perspective of the program. And when you look at it, the Urbanized Area Formula Program really is a big winner. From IIJA to FAST Act, it'll grow about 41%. I want to put that in perspective, especially with some of the things that Cheryl will talk to you about in a minute here. Right now, part of how a region gets its money is based upon how many service miles are put. So you put a bus or you put a van on the road. For every mile it's on the road, it generates an amount. And right now that amount is about 43 cents per revenue mile is what it's called. We estimate that will increase to about 60 cents a revenue mile. Now think about that post-COVID. Every agency in the country has struggled to deal with labor issues, safety issues, ridership issues, changing commute patterns. A lot of things have changed since 2019 to now, including how much service a lot of agencies have put in place. So the quicker your region can add new service, can use this money to leverage and expand service, man, those areas that take advantage of it and really put new service on the street are going to benefit in so many ways, not only in the service they're providing, but also the amount of money that they'll be bringing back to their regions to continue to expand their transit networks. So just real quickly, we'll flow through these slides here. The rural program, you'll see, increased 41%. The state of good repair program, 41%. Bus facility formula program, you guessed it, 41%. The 5340 growing in urban area, 41%. Now here's the wrench. The FTA research program only grew by 38%. But here's the important part. The money is now guaranteed. The FTA Office of Research is known for a number of programs lately. Mobility on Demand Sandbox, programs like that. The difference between now and then is previously the funding that those agencies, that FTA Office of Research received, was subject to annual appropriations. Now the funding is guaranteed. So US DOT, FTA in particular, knows exactly how much money its Office of Research will have every year. It'll allow the Office of Research a little bit more time to think about and plan through a series of projects and programs, rather than every once in a while saying, hey, we've got $8 million, let's go do something. So I think there's a real opportunity for the FTA Office of Research to really build off a lot of the steps it's taken in the last 5 or 6 years. I will simply close by just going through a couple of different grant programs that are made available through FTA. The first of which is the Bus Facility Program. As I mentioned, there's both a formula program as well as a competitive grant program. We expect this notice of funding availability for Bus Facility to come out next week. The rumor is it'll come out January 31st. This program is roughly $2 billion over the 5 years and creates obviously the ability for transit agencies to grow and expand their bus and van fleets. I will say that van pool projects are certainly eligible under Bus Facility. But the real, I think, new program that should be noted, or it's not new, but it's the LONO program. There's a particular emphasis in this legislation to see an enhanced electrification. And you see that here. The LONO program used to be a $47 million pot of money that all of us competed for. This authorization bill creates $5.6 billion for transit agencies to electrify their buses. Now, from a van pool's perspective, there is no van that currently is available that we can use in terms of electric vans for van pooling. However, the team at Enterprise assures me that they are on top of it and working with OEMs and others. And the minute one becomes available, I'm certain they'll be integrated into the fleet. But nonetheless, $5.6 billion for low emission buses is a significant element, significant funding. So I'll just close very briefly by talking a little bit about the timeline of IIJA. And a little bit more clarity was provided last week when the White House released a sort of draft schedule of when these grants will be coming through. But again, you see here, we'll begin to see notices of funding availability in the coming weeks. As I mentioned, Bus Facility will be next week, as will the RAISE grants, and then others that we've talked about will be coming through this spring and summer. So with that, I will turn it over to Cheryl.
Great. Thank you, Jason. Man, that's a wealth of information. We are so appreciative of all of the work that you do for us and the team, really taking a complex policy and breaking it down in very digestible amounts. So thank you, Jason, for all your work. Thank you for diving in to that with us. And so now I'm going to talk a little bit about how the IIJA impacts your van pool programs. But we're not only going to talk about how they impact your van pool programs, but how creating or expanding your van pool program will help you meet the requirements of the IIJA and historical funding sources currently used in van pool programs. However, before we get to that, let's look at our audience and see your familiarity with van pool programs. We're going to put up our last poll. I think we've got it up. Oh, there it is. If you guys wouldn't mind typing in or selecting an answer. It's not typed in this time. Got some mixed results coming in, some without a program, some directly operated, some purchased transportation. Good. Good. Well, thank you. Thank you for those answers. Yeah, it's a good mix, about 33% through those first three. Cool. All right, well, let's get into it. So my first slide. The benefits of van pool programs. So like I said, we're not only going to talk about how the IIJA can affect your van pool program by either helping you to create a new one or expand your existing program, but we're also going to talk about what are the benefits of van pool to your community, how they help you align with the requirements and different funding sources, and a wealth of other opportunities that are available. So I'm going to spend quite a bit of time on this particular slide. Let's talk about mode shift. So when we're talking about a van pool program, whether you're creating a new one or expanding your existing program, riders on van pools are not your typical fixed route riders, right? Based on where they live, where they work, the schedules that they work, or the distance between those destinations. They're not typically getting on a bus or a rail line. So when you incorporate a van pool program or help to expand your existing one, you're getting new transit riders. You're building that ridership. but you're also helping to switch from single occupancy vehicles to high occupancy vehicles. And so that brings us to congestion relief. You know, we've all seen that graphic where you see a packed freeway and everybody's driving alone in their vehicle, and then you see the same amount of people in a bus or in a van pool or in a couple carpools. And so we've all seen that, and we're definitely doing that and reaching that goal through the IIJA, as well as other funding options that are used today in van pool programs. But also let's start to think about what happens when I go after a RAISE grant, otherwise known as Build or Tiger, as Jason was talking about. And I'm going to be doing construction on this roadway, and that's going to cause delays and backups and congestion. Well, let me build into that grant a van pool program so that I can help my community still freely flow through that congested area or that construction area while that construction is going on. Which also brings us to carbon reduction. So due to that mode shift, we're inherently going to help out with those carbon reduction goals. We're going to save some of those emissions. So not only are you getting that through converting into a van pool program or expanding your van pool program, but as Jason mentioned, with the inclusion of electric vehicles, that's just going to take that number and increase it exponentially, right? We at Enterprise, we are looking at the electric vehicle market very closely. I think there's something like 400 electric vehicles either in design or production. As soon as there is a good, viable option in the 7 to 15 passenger range, they will be put into our fleet. So hopefully in the very near future, we'll be able to help you increase those carbon reduction goals at a faster rate. Lastly, job access and equality. So with a van pool program, you're connecting individuals to opportunities and employers to a workforce. So van pools help to accommodate all sorts of commuting routes, right? Whether it's that traditional route where folks are coming into a city center from a suburban or rural area, or they're doing that reverse commute where they're living downtown and they're going out to that manufacturing center or distribution center that isn't near anything, let alone a fixed route transit option. We're also helping to expand that labor pool. Oftentimes when we talk to employers and we do mapping exercises with them, we're talking about their existing employee population. But what about those people that didn't even apply for the job because they couldn't get there or they thought that they couldn't get there? How do we address that? And so all of these 4 items, as well as more, are your main benefits of a van pool program and what we hope to help solve, if I could talk properly, in working alongside you and accessing the IIJA opportunities. The benefits of a van pool program also helps to support traditional transit. We're not here to be competitive with fixed route options. We're here to complement those options. And we do that through a host of different ways. So for one, it's a cost-effective form of public transit. All of the operating costs can be recovered through the fare box revenue. And in a purchase transportation situation, AKA a contracted van pool program, that capital cost is typically around 35 cents per revenue mile. That is significantly more efficient than other modes of public transit. We're also going to help to increase that core transit ridership. On that last slide, I talked about how we're creating new transit riders by adding or expanding our van pool operations. And that can't be, it's true, right? We're expanding those options, we're creating new transit ridership, which at the end of the day helps transit agencies and other public entities increase those ridership numbers that are oh so important for future funding. We're also helping to create multimodal systems, a true multimodal system, giving folks options, looking at how am I moving about my day? How am I getting to work? Can I use a van pool? Okay, I use a van pool to get to work. What about that trip to the grocery store? Maybe I could take that on a bus, or maybe I can get on my bike and do it, or what have you. It gets people thinking. Which brings me to my next point. It increases the availability of transit options, or not availability, the visibility, if I could, again, read properly. So let's say that you've got some rail and bus lines out there, but now you've got all of these van pools traveling around the city, going up and down the highways. That's increasing the brand awareness of your transit agency or your public entity, as well as getting people thinking about, well, how am I moving around? Why am I stuck in this traffic when I see these van pools taking the HOV lane and getting to work much faster than I am? And finally, van pooling helps to address gaps in service, as well as diversity, equality, and inclusion initiatives. So you can see in the graph on the left-hand side is sort of an illustration of all of these points that I've just talked through. But let's break it down to a very simple example. So in that graph, you can see that we might have some rail lines that go north-south and east-west. And then we could have some bus lines that go cross-directionally. Everywhere you see a green arrow is where van pooling can help fill some of those service gaps and help to make your transit system equitable for your entire community, while also increasing that footprint of that public transit system. My next slide here, van pooling is just a good business decision at the end of the day. On one end, the federal matching area, there are new as well as existing funding options under federal highway that can be used at 100% federal share. So you can actually start this program or expand your program. I noticed in the chat there are a couple of folks who want to learn more about expanding their program. You can do that without spending any local dollars. And then if you're utilizing federal transit money, typically, like under 5307, you've got that 80-20 split of federal share versus local match. If you are in a contracted or purchased transportation van pool scenario, you can utilize that fare box revenue as that 20% local match, increasing the flexibility of your program, enabling your agency to be more responsive to market forces, which is oh so important in this day and age, especially as we continue to feel the effects of COVID. And what that does is that helps to invite private investment in transit when you are utilizing either a purchased transportation or contracted program. Finally, we want to generate additional funds for your overall transit agency. And that's exactly what van pool does. It is one of the only modes, if not the only mode, that generates more funding than it actually uses. So at the end of the day, it's a good business decision. And so let's talk a little bit about how we generate those formula funds. So there's 4 factors really that the FTA looks at to determine, okay, how much money are we allocating to our local grantees across the nation? And those 4 factors are listed on the screen. The first 2 factors, population and population density, we can't affect, right? They're based on the census. We still have another 8 years or so before we see any changes in that. However, vehicle revenue miles and the incentive tier are 2 areas in which van pooling can help you build more formula funds to either create or expand your van pool program and help you out with funding for some of your other areas at your agency. The vehicle revenue mile factor, Jason talked about how we see a 41% increase in those factors. That's easy, right? That's the easy formula. The incentive tier, it's a little bit more complex. That takes into account, that formula is passenger miles squared divided by operating expenses. That's a little complicated. I'm not an accountant, but we definitely have people that help us out with those calculations. What a van pool program does in the incentive tier is it helps you increase your passenger miles. That's going to help you on the top part of that equation. It also adds those passenger miles at a very efficient and effective rate. So therefore, increasing the performance of your overall system and growing your formula funds at a faster rate. So all in all, again, a good business decision. So let's use an example, right? What do these numbers really mean? So we're going to keep them nice round numbers. We're going to say we have a 100 van pool program. And in our 100 van pool program, you can see that our vans have the specifics that are listed down in the green box. There's 100 vans. There's typically 252 working days in a year. You can see the subsidy level and commute length. So when we apply those demographics to our 100 van pool program, calculation, total for the year of 2.52 million vehicle revenue miles. When you apply those miles to the formula fund under to the formula under FTA, utilizing the new amounts in the IIJA, as well as adding in that incentive tier, you come up with an amount of $1.9 million generated by that 100 van pool program. Conversely, if we look at the cost to that public agency that is sponsoring that van pool program at a $600 per van per month subsidy, that contract cost is only $720,000. So do some quick math there. That means that in year 3, when those funds start to roll back into your program based on that data that you're reporting on your van pool program, you'll be able to keep those 100 vans on the road. And you'll also be able to grow them with that additional $1.2 million. Or maybe we just grow the van pool program a little bit and we use that extra money for other services that we have in our system that we need to pay attention to. And so that's the financial side of things. Going back more towards the environmental piece, that 100 van program will save 12.2 million pounds of CO2. That's a big number. I don't even know that I can envision what 12.2 million pounds is. I feel like I maybe gained that much during COVID, but that's another story for another time. The cost of that carbon reduction is $118 per ton. That's it. So not only are you providing a program that's going to expand your transit system, it's going to more effectively service your community, it's going to do so at a very efficient price point, and it's going to help you reach your carbon reduction goals. I think that's a win all around. Let's take that one step further and let's look at some other metrics, right? So let's say we had a 50 van program or a 300 van program. You guys can see on this graph that these are some pretty impressive numbers. It just makes sense to either create or expand your van pool program. And we're happy to talk with you about either creating that program or expanding your existing program or whatever your situation might be to help you get to some of these goals and help to really service our communities in the way in which they should be serviced. Okay, so we just went through a ton of policy. I just rambled through some benefits of a van pool program. For those of you on the call who want to start a program, what are those next steps? And so we've broken it down into 4 relatively easy steps. So 1, you want to secure the funding to seed the program. Again, we've just talked about a ton of options for you all to do that. And we're happy to talk through any and all of those options or what you're thinking or your questions that you might have about those funding options. And then your second step would be to procure or pilot a turnkey van pool program, figuring out what is the eligibility? What is the geographic reach of this program? Do I actually need to go through a procurement, or can I pilot a program to help gauge the demand in my area and then do a procurement at a later date? Number 3, if you're not the direct recipient of FTA formula funds in your area, you want to create an agreement with that direct recipient so that those funds that are generated by the van pool program will flow back into the van pool program. And finally, we're going to celebrate. We're going to celebrate that you've expanded your transit agency, that you're helping your community, and you're helping to meet those carbon reduction goals. On the flip side of that, let's say that you already have a van pool program. what should you be thinking about, or what do we think you should be thinking about here at Commute with Enterprise? So here's just 3 questions for you to get you thinking about what next steps might be. Are you maximizing or leveraging your subsidy to the highest level? Program costs have increased. I think the latest number, and Enterprise folks, keep me honest on this, I think vehicle costs have increased by 37%. That's outrageous. Has your subsidy increased that much as well to keep it an equitable and economical option for your community? We're also finding that percentage-based subsidies, as opposed to flat rate structures, help to increase that equality and equity within your community as well. As those costs increase, your subsidy is increasing right along with them. And there's no work on either end to make changes in that. Secondly, do you want to expand? You know, again, we've just gone through a ton of options that you can use to expand your program. Let's look at CMAQ or carbon reduction. Let's utilize those to beef up that marketing or advertising or employer outreach campaign to help build and grow that vanpool program. And finally, what are your relationships with your employers in your area? You know, work with your vanpool vendor or internally at your agency to really take a step back and assess those relationships. Where are we? Can we help our existing employers more? Can we develop new relationships in our area to help people access our entire transit system, not just vanpool, but of course at Commute with Enterprise, we would like to see vanpools grown as well. So with that, I will pass it back over to Mike to close it out for us.
Great. Thank you, Cheryl. Thank you, Jason. That was some fantastic information. I'll wrap things up with a sneak peek at our investments to transform and modernize our vanpool offering. We are building personalized vanpool options for the modern workforce. Riders will subscribe for the number of days they need with all-inclusive personal commute plan. Reservation paths will allow for riders who come to work on different days each week or have a recurring schedule to reserve seats only on the days they need. Technology will also allow for easy recognition of riders and checks against their daily roster to ensure accuracy in ridership reporting. In-app messaging will make it easy for riders and drivers to connect and coordinate, and we are also exposing all of our capabilities to MOS partners to fit our commute offerings into employee travel management platforms as well. We are truly excited about the enhancements and look forward to helping solve tomorrow's transportation needs and delivering them to the industry. In closing, to our partners on the call, thank you. And we look forward to discussing with you these options, these opportunities, and product enhancements. For those of you exploring opportunities to reduce congestion, reduce emissions, and provide additional commuting options in your communities, we look forward to the opportunity to partner with you. We believe this legislation is a huge turning point for the transportation future and mobility moving forward, and we are pleased to be a small part of that. We'll be sending out a recording of the webinar with a summary, as well as the answers to any questions that we did not get to in the chat. Finally, there'll be a survey that pops up at the end, and we'd love to have your feedback. Cheryl, Jason, thank you all very much. And attendees on the call, thanks for sticking with us and have a great rest of your week.
Have a good night, everyone.